Chapter 12. The Market for Energy. Conventional market analysis fails almost completely to get to grips with the enormous changes needed to save the world from climate catastrophe. To quote Dr. Ma Jun, climate change is the area of most visible externality, which means that the market does not really work in this particular space. And you need to correct that market failure by government policy instruments, including central bank instruments. The recognition of this market failure is starting to be seen in the West. Most energy markets of today are designed for the world of fossil fuels. Their rules, applied to the altogether different nature of renewable energy, become such complex, noisy systems that, absent imposed external coordinated change, they fail to enable the investment environment needed to transform. As described by Sir Dieter Helm, an economist at Oxford University, the wholesale market is a 20th century answer to a 21st century market. And it's not working. Instead of designing for the decarbonised economies of the future and backwards planning with roadmaps to the needed market changes to provide clear investment signals, we are stuck, incrementing from socio-economic systems that are not fit for the purpose of decarbonisation at the speed and scale that the climate demands. Time, or lack thereof, is a major factor. What is required in the energy sector to help solve the climate crisis has been likened to the Industrial Revolution at digital speed. Keynesian economists would recognise markets take time to correct, time that we do not have. Moreover, they would suggest market signals fail in the complex context described above. And so coordination, leadership, planning, and enhanced market integration are required to deliver the transformation. The EU energy market reform, prompted by the 2022 energy crisis and concluded in May 2024, was set initially to challenge some fundamental principles of the power market, the merit order and marginal pricing. But following strong lobbying, the result was a small reform, soft on ambition. This chapter, as updated and expanded extensively in this second edition, aims to present why the job needs to be completed urgently. Yet energy market reform cannot be done in isolation from the technology context. This book highlights technology scenarios that have not yet been contemplated in the context of energy market reform. The supergrid enables deep renewable energy penetration and redistribution of complementary wind and solar resources, with optimal system-wide efficiencies. Pan-European system modelling will be vital and will challenge ideas around nodal pricing, for example. Furthermore, it is critical for policymakers and market architects to appreciate the characteristics of modularity, scalability, and the experience curve inherent in the major energy system decarbonisation technologies: wind, solar, storage, and transmission. As experience grows with installed capacity, feedback drives, further technology innovation, manufacturing improvements, and total lifetime cost reductions, enabling accelerated deployment in the right supportive environment. Failing to grasp the implications of the supergrid, the transition to fuel-free generation technologies, or the modular nature of the key low-carbon generation, storage and enhanced grid technologies will lead policy, market reforms, and investments in the direction of less efficient, dirtier solutions in the near-medium term. It will lock Europe into a higher overall cost base and avoidable emissions, and result in costly delay of the opportunities of the decarbonised future we desire. Let us first examine the role of energy in society and the energy market as a whole. On the basis that we have committed as nations and as the EU through political goals stated at COP, and with legally binding targets to decarbonise our economies, we will examine the evidence that markets as they stand today are utterly failing to deliver this outcome. We will consider the consequences of corrections not yet taken, the investment vacuum, the vicious circle, and the delay that is resulting from the radical changes needed but not yet planned. Yet these challenges are far from insurmountable. We will contrast our current situation to the coordinated monetary, fiscal, industrial and energy policies producing successful transformation and economic gain elsewhere. And we will offer some proposals for Europe. Energy is critical to society. Just like food, energy is necessary for survival. We need it in some form for everything. At the most basic level, to cook, to keep ourselves warm, to farm, and transport foods necessary for our local survival, to be productive, and to facilitate every aspect of modern life. The weaponization of energy in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has reaffirmed energy security as a theme. The cost of living crisis which followed is rooted in the increased cost of energy. Now, as ever, energy price and availability are a barometer of the popularity of any particular government. Working for the ESB in the 1970s, the Irish state-owned electricity company, I had to deal with queries from politicians about why the lights were out and why a local lack of electricity was not allowing people to cook their meals. Being on the generation side of the ESB, I had no idea why any particular area was without power. I could sense why politicians were extremely concerned about lack of electricity in their areas. This fundamental fear of a temporary lack of energy is a primary hurdle slowing the energy transition. Market characteristics. A free market is an economic system in which prices are determined by unrestricted competition between privately owned businesses. It is an economic system in which the prices of goods and services are determined by market forces, supply and demand, rather than government controls, a price-setting monopoly or some other authority. It is the same as an open market. It contrasts with a regulated market, or command economy, where the government intervenes in supply and demand, and does not let the market find its own way freely. In a free market, most businesses and property belong to individuals and entities in the private sector, rather than to the state. It is of central interest to all us citizens to explore what this allegedly free market does in the case of energy. The idea of a free market in energy is a dangerous myth. The argument goes as follows. Even in so-called deregulated electricity markets, neither wholesale nor retail markets are free. In many markets around the globe, marketization or liberalization of electricity markets has occurred in wholesale electricity markets, usually electricity sold to electric utilities and industrials on a day-ahead basis. Wholesale markets are governed by complex, market-specific rules and regulations, which are tweaked regularly around dispatch, capacity, and other considerations, all designed for a fossil fuel-dominant generation mix, to which renewable energy generation has to conform as a price taker. They are the opposite of what is generally understood as a free market. Marketization has not broadly occurred in retail markets. In Europe, 12 EU member states still had some form of state intervention in retail electricity prices as of 2020, according to the ACER Annual Report 2021. The underlying prices awarded in the wholesale market depend largely on volatile fossil fuel pricing, and the vast majority of fossil fuels are owned and controlled by governments and the OPEC cartel. Something in the order of 90% of all oil and gas reserves are owned directly by governments and state entities. They account for about 2/3 of global production. Further, the IEA identifies that 59% of fossil fuel-based assets in developing economies and 21% in advanced economies are state-owned. So the markets for fossil fuel-based energy do not meet the first criteria of a free market. These governments do not act unilaterally. That is to say that they consider what the other oil-owning partner governments are doing. In fact, they form a cartel. Oil and gas producing nations have formed a cartel, OPEC, to agree on production quantities and to control prices. So as we can see, the notion of a free market, in which prices are determined by private actors according to the laws of supply and demand, and without intervention or manipulation, does not apply to the oil and gas markets, nor by extension in the wholesale electricity markets, where gas often determines the marginal price. Furthermore, there are significant subsidies paid directly and implicitly by governments, the public, for fossil fuels. Despite the widespread availability of fossil fuels, and as we will see later, the enormous profits they earn, the national champions are subsidised by almost all governments. See Figure 44. According to the IMF Fossil Fuel Subsidies Data 2023 update, globally, fossil fuel subsidies were $7 trillion in 2022, or 7.1% of GDP. Explicit subsidies, undercharging for supply costs, have more than doubled since 2020, but are still only 18% of the total subsidy, while nearly 60% is due to undercharging for global warming and local air pollution. Differences between efficient prices and retail fuel prices are large and pervasive. For example, 80% of global coal consumption was priced at below half of its efficient level in 2022. According to the European Court of Auditors, EU countries spent €56 billion on fossil fuel subsidies in 2019, primarily tax cuts, exemptions, and lower levies, with 15 states spending more on fossil fuels than renewable energy. During the latest energy crisis, with extreme volatility in gas and oil prices, subsidising households to avoid fossil fuel-induced fuel poverty cost governments billions throughout the continent. UK government data indicates, for example, a total net cost of energy support policies in 2022 to 23 was £51.1 billion, 2% of GDP. On the other hand, many governments take excise duty on fuels. Many advanced governments also take a significant share of the revenues that flow from the use of fossil fuels. Before carbon taxes became normal, governments were imposing excise duties on fuels. Excise duty, mineral oil tax, makes up a large part of the price of petrol and diesel in Ireland. For example, €0.64 mineral oil tax is charged on every litre of petrol. In the UK, they charge a fuel duty of £0.58 per litre on both petrol and diesel. And often, governments have misaligned heating energy taxes, overtaxing electricity at the expense of decarbonising heat. heat is responsible for an enormous portion of total emissions globally. Electrification of heating, space heating and industrial processes, using well-established technologies, is significantly more energy efficient, with further technologies emerging and improving all the time. The difference in the cost to the consumer of gas and electricity is referred to as the spark gap, and is ultimately the critical factor in the decision as to how to heat, electrify, or burn stuff. A portion of the spark gap, sometimes very significant, can arise due to a different tax treatment for heating fuels compared to electricity. This may economically disincentivize electric heating options, such as heat pumps, despite their superior efficiency and carbon intensity. A 2022 paper by the Regulatory Assistance Project, RAP, identified an imbalance in energy taxation across almost all European markets, with 3 overtaxing electricity by more than 200%, and makes the case for reform. In summary, it is arguable that governments would not want a free market, even if a cartel did not control the fundamental price. All markets for electricity are in fact regulated to some degree, reinforcing the truth that the old adage that the price of electricity is what government wants to charge for it. Why? Energy is crucial to all aspects of society. By comparison, in the international transport and distribution sectors of the oil and gas industry, there is much more of a market approach. This is because there are thousands of smaller companies involved in shipping, storage, distribution, infrastructure, and selling of fossil fuels. They don't control the price of the basic commodity, but they compete to win customers and market share. Competition works for a small share of the final price that the customer pays. Food is also crucial to populations, and it is not regulated, at least not in the same way as energy is. Yet food is more driven by market forces than energy is. General export quotas are prohibited by WTO rules. By comparison, the 13 OPEC members meet every 6 months in Vienna to restrict or increase production. Energy industry profitability. What is the consequence of energy markets as they are currently set up? It is instructive to examine the profitability of the oil and gas majors in the context of the energy transition that is happening from fossils to sustainability, and contrast this with profitability in the renewable energy industry, right across the value chain. Research by The Guardian in late 2021 found the largest 24 non-state-owned oil and gas companies, including Exxon, Chevron, Shell, and BP, made a combined $174 billion in profits in the first 9 months of the year as gasoline prices climbed in the US. That was a record year in itself, but profits ballooned in 2022 with skyrocketing energy prices the first year of the Ukrainian invasion. As a whole, the industry amassed $4 trillion in total profits in 2022, up from an average of $1.5 trillion in prior years, according to the IEA. These have remained at elevated levels in 2023. Both national oil and gas companies, those that are majority state-owned, Saudi Aramco as the undisputed leader, but also, for example, Petrobras, Equinor, PetroChina, etc., and non-state or private oil and gas majors make enormous profits. They are all very powerful entities in society and the cornerstone of stock exchanges. Alessandro Blasi, an IEA special advisor, recently highlighted the power of national oil and gas companies, noting that Saudi Aramco earned $121 billion in 2023, more than Exxon, Shell, Chevron, BP, and other majors combined in the same year. The Biden administration has warned fuel price hikes are hurting low-income families, even as it attempts to implement a climate agenda that would see the US move away from fossil fuels, and it released 50 million barrels of oil from the National Strategic Reserve to help dampen costs. Yet the big oil and gas companies, primarily those in the Gulf, who have most spare production capacity, have shown little willingness so far to ramp up production to help reduce costs. A report by the government watchdog group Accountable US accuses them of taking advantage of bloated prices, fleecing American families along the way, amid ongoing fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. Americans looking for someone to blame for the pain they experience at the pump need look no further than the wealthy oil and gas company executives who choose to line their own pockets rather than lower gas prices with the billions of dollars in profit big oil rakes in month after month, said Kyle Herrick, president of Accountable US. It is immoral for oil and gas companies to be making record profits from this energy crisis on the backs of the poorest people and communities at a massive cost to the climate, said the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres in 2022, as he called on governments to tax windfall profits. The analysis of major oil companies' financials shows 11 of the group gave payouts to shareholders worth more than $36.5 billion collectively in 2021, while a dozen bought back $8 billion worth of stock. In 2023, Chevron bought back $26.3 billion under a $75 billion 5-year buyback plan. Apparently, it can think of nothing more productive to do with all that cash. Excellent insights are gained from IEA's 2023 World Energy Investment Report, as presented by Visual Capitalist in December 2023, How the Oil and Gas Industry Spends Its Money. A record 39% of cash spent by the industry in 2022 was dividends paid to shareholders. Meanwhile, investment in low-carbon technologies is immaterial. 2023 investment in new fossil fuel supply is expected to increase by 6% to $950 billion, it states. And current capital expenditures in fossil fuels are more than double what is required to achieve the IEA's 2050 net zero emissions scenario. Almost no other sector of economic activity is allowed such latitude. Not only are such profits allowed, but oil and gas companies don't pay for the damage they impose on society. Attribution science is a growing field of study. It now allows the IPCC to make virtually certain statements linking extreme weather events and the damage caused to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, the burning of fossil fuels. In 2023, the World Economic Forum reported study findings estimating the cost of damage from climate change-attributed extreme weather events totaling $2.86 trillion between 2000 and 2019, or, as the headline states, $16 million per hour. It goes on to forecast an annual cost of climate change damage of $1.7 trillion to $3.1 trillion by 2050. Jacobson estimates an annual cost today of over $30 trillion for all air pollution, death and illness, noting 90 to 95% of air pollution deaths are caused by anthropogenic air pollution. One can easily construct the arguments that fossil fuel executives make to governments, which run as follows. You don't impose control on Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Iraq, etc., who are making more profits than us. So why do it to us? We are collectively only 20% of the market. As one well-known senior oil and gas executive remarked to me, and probably many others, as it is so evidently true, you could kill my company, but where would that get you? The 70% of manufacture and 90% of ownership still exist. This may be true, but it does not negate the fact that the incentives under the current scheme, and indeed the market designs, are entirely skewed to maintain a status quo. A status quo which handsomely rewards the things that hurt us. Money flows to where it makes the most return. Pension funds are under pressure to provide for the future income of retirees. Sovereign wealth funds are similar, insofar as governments wish to make hay when the sun shines, and accumulate large reserves which can be used in the future to ensure the wealth of society. Private investors need little rationale to invest where the returns are highest. Returns on solar and wind, onshore and offshore, have since 2019 been reported in the media as having fallen to levels in the range 5 to 8%, with few exceptions. This can be slightly higher for developers who successfully bring projects all the way through from first greenfield development to construction, but rarely do they achieve returns in the low mid-teens, typical of the early mid-2010s. By contrast, oil and gas projects are reported as generating returns of 15% or more. As Pelita Clark asks, why switch to the uncertainty of a renewable sector with no cartel, no comparable record of returns, and, for some green firms, no stonking profits like those made last year as the war in Ukraine supercharged fossil fuel prices? But as we have seen, given the level of state ownership, subsidy, and interventions, energy markets are anything but free. Their design, and subsequently the returns earned by various participants, are a political choice. There is as complete a contrast as is imaginable when the profits of oil and gas companies are compared with the profits made in the wind turbine and solar manufacturing sector. Here, especially in the wind sector, profits are zero at best, see figure 46, worsening persistently over the last 10 or so years. In recent years, renewable energy developers and generation plant owners have also seen their profits erode to levels that make an increasing portion of new wind and solar investments unattractive for most private capital. This has occurred over time in an energy industry in which renewable players have no market power. In the face of enormous competition, all the benefits of the impressive fall in the cost of renewable energy have been captured by consumers, utility companies that resell to the consumer, or energy traders. Interested readers can take a deep dive into the paradox of poor profitability and therefore lack of investment, despite the cheapness of wind and solar compared to any other forms of generation, in the 2024 book The Price is Wrong by Brett Christophers. While its conclusion, to fully nationalise all renewable infrastructure, is not one shared by these authors, not least since it ignores the trillions of capital required, beyond the reach of the public purse, most of the book serves to educate comprehensively on this complex topic. For those with less time, or as an effective introduction, we recommend the thorough review by Niall Enright in his newsletter, Key Books on Climate Change. Renewable energy, the investment case under stress in unfit markets. Typically, electricity can be sold in 3 or 4 ways. 1. Wholesale markets, traded day ahead, mixed fossil fuel and renewable energy generation. 2. Under contract, power purchase agreement or PPA, with utilities, often relatively short, circa 3-year terms, retail supply companies. 3. Through public procurement contracts, often awarded through price-based reverse auction, where the lowest bids win long-term supply contracts, or, in some markets, 4. Under contract, PPA, directly with private companies as end users. Given the significant capital required to build new renewable energy plants, most are non-recourse project financed, meaning they must prove to lenders that the project can, under various stress scenarios, comfortably sustain its debt repayments, principal plus interest, over the long term, from its revenues alone. Simply put, the project must, standing on its own 2 feet, expect to generate revenues that cover build, operating, and financing costs, with a lender-required buffer, plus equity investor return, with a premium to adjust for project build and operating risks. The equity return is the investor's reward for their development and asset delivery expertise, and payment for the money they provided, patiently. It is often at risk for 5 to 10 years. In wholesale markets, as outlined earlier, revenues are volatile and highly uncertain. The typical market rules mean these are structurally completely mismatched for the fixed cost base of operating renewable energy plant. Generally, for non-recourse financed assets, this disqualifies wholesale markets as a primary revenue stream, pushing the majority of renewable generation into intensive competition with other renewable generators in the remaining routes to market. An objective Porter-style industry analysis across the available routes to market, as they stand currently for renewable energy generation, would suggest renewable energy generators have very little market power as participants in any of these markets. The markets, as they are not set up to differentiate and value positive externalities provided by renewable energy or penalise negative externalities of fossil fuel energy. As such, the rules mean competition is not fair. Over the past 15 years, intense competition, as well as the efficiencies earned through scale and experience, have resulted in a fall in renewable energy power prices, which have already accrued enormous benefits to the consumer and other value chain participants. But this has been at the expense of the renewable energy sector, the generators, and the supply chain. With limited market power, uncompensated value attributes, and sector-specific intense competition sustained for over a decade, the resulting declining profitability has eroded investment appetite. Then, in a post-COVID era, the cost base for new construction projects escalated significantly across material and transport, as well as interest rates not seen previously in this renewable energy age. Acute market failure. If the market, as it stands, is a primary instrument relied upon to promote the build-out of renewable energy at the speed and scale required to fulfill climate targets and legally binding emissions goals, it is failing. Specifically, we point to the following as evidence of acute market failure. A. Externalities. The subsidization of fossil fuels by renewable energy. Renewable energy saves the people of the world from the devastating effects of global warming. A study published in Nature in April 2024 calculated the damage due to the climate crisis would reduce global GDP by 19% within the next 30 years. This is the enormous socialized cost of fossil fuels. There is no recognition for this in the tariff paid for electricity, either attributing societal cost or assigning value for avoidance to the higher quality product. Neoliberal economists want to see competition between renewable generators, and no allowances are made for the money saved by society at large for the avoidance of pollution. Little, if any, of the carbon taxes levied on the customer find their way into the balance sheets of the renewable companies. This bogus economic competitive policy trap has resulted in wind and solar effectively subsidising fossil fuel generation. Fossil fuel and clean energies are treated economically as if they are the same. They are not. It is notable that the current technology for direct air capture, removing carbon from the atmosphere, requires a price of about $800 per tonne. B. Price cannibalisation. The more wind and solar on the system, the lower the price for electricity generally, and specifically the price awarded in the wholesale market. The needed growth in the renewable sector would mean it eats its own lunch. Perversion does not begin to describe the horror of this. The newcomer to the electricity industry, the non-polluting player, is used by governments the world over to reduce customer price pressure. In practice, however, what this does is it renders the wholesale market a non-investable, unbankable route to market for new renewable energy plant, severely limiting options for capacity growth. An increasingly common issue is the reality of awarding zero marginal prices to wind, and especially solar during peak solar generation hours, when the total renewable generation available in a wholesale market fully meets the total demand. On one hand, this is the desired outcome, fully decarbonised electricity supply, at least for a period. On the other hand, under current market designs, that same electricity supply is being paid nothing during that time. Zero. This sounds absolutely wonderful for consumers, although it's likely that they don't receive the cost benefit, as most won't be on dynamic pricing tariffs. And it is mainly their energy supply companies or utilities who will capture the upside of price arbitrage. And this hints at certain motivations to maintain a status quo. But since neither building the renewable energy plant nor financing it are free, it means losses for the plant owners, who in deregulated or liberalised markets are often not the same entity as the utility company. And if this continues often enough, the possibility that their lenders will not be paid. This creates waves of negative investment and lending signals, an absolute deterrent for future investment to complete the energy transition. This situation is evolving most severely in markets where solar build-out in particular is rapid, possibly exacerbated by other typical energy transition situations, such as grid expansion that is not keeping pace with renewables, insufficient grid flexibility mechanisms offered by new storage infrastructure, and insufficient market mechanisms to incentivize a shift in consumption behaviour towards peak generation times, demand management, e.g. in Chile in the period 2023 to time of writing. While certainly cheap, the mythical free solar energy is a fallacy, and the feature of current wholesale market designs which allows generators to be paid nothing for the energy they deliver due to zero marginal pricing is a significant threat to the speed of the energy transition, especially when we know the technologies that go towards solving the load-shifting challenges are commercial or very nearly commercial today. Battery storage, utility domestic and EVs, domestic hot water storage, thermal storage, fire bricks or similar for industrial and even domestic applications, to name a few. C. Uncompensated value attributes, cost reduction and price stability. In all national markets, renewable energy is used by government to reduce the price of electricity for customers. In the post-COVID volatile period of 2021 to 2023, with energy shocks precipitated by the Ukrainian invasion, the IEA calculated that newly installed wind and solar installation saved European customers €100 billion. Persistent and significant benefits to consumers were realised over the last 10 to 15 years, well before that period of severe fossil fuel price volatility, as competition in the renewable energy sector spurred investment for innovation and technological improvement. This resulted in total electricity cost reduction and a dampening of the impact of volatility of fossil fuel prices on electricity price. While each new iteration brought improved levelised cost of energy, LCOE, most cost benefits were passed on to the end customer. Generation revenues earned did not keep pace with the cost reductions, and OEM margins also eroded steadily as a consequence. The systematic lack of market power means generators cannot capture the value of price stability they deliver, nor are the markets designed to reward them for this. D. Structurally unfair risk allocation. To illustrate with an example, since Mainstream started bidding in reverse auctions for contracts in Chile, the auction price awarded to new electricity generation has fallen from 11 US cents per kilowatt hour to 4 US cents per kilowatt hour due to wind and solar installations. Since these auctions were effectively public procurement processes with supply companies in the regulated market, the result was a direct benefit on the cost of living in Chile. Similar patterns have been happening around the world. While this is great for the customer, it masks the pain experienced by the wind turbine manufacturers. In Mainstream's latest 1,300 megawatt build program in Chile, to supply the equivalent of 1 in 6 of all households in the country, the Power Purchase Agreement (PPA) contracts were signed following award at auction in 2016. But in 2019, right before financing and construction, Senvion, the contracted turbine manufacturer, went out of business, at high cost to Mainstream. This failure is not an isolated incident. Similar tales of major risks materializing at great cost to the project have increasingly been experienced by developers and manufacturers globally. This increases the cost of capital and prevents investment in otherwise construction-ready projects, all resulting in delay to the energy transition. E. Wind original equipment manufacturers, OEMs, as a critical contributor to decarbonisation, a uniformly unprofitable sector. In a highly competitive renewable energy sector, where OEMs invested heavily in innovation and technological improvement, the shelf life of a turbine model dropped from 5 years down to about 18 months by 2019. Each new technology platform cost hundreds of millions in investment on the part of the OEMs. However, with increasingly competitive auctions and a lot of uncertainty around future orders as politically driven public procurement plans stopped and started across key markets, it became increasingly difficult to recoup value on those investments. The deteriorating financials of the major wind turbine manufacturers over the past number of years paints a stark picture. Losses and consistently poor profitability block further investment. We have seen consolidation of the industry as well as bankruptcies. The root causes of the declining profitability can be traced back to before the period illustrated, since the dawn of hyper-competitive public procurement auctions. But the effects are clearly evident across that 5-year period, and further exacerbated by the macroeconomic turmoil of recent years. Recent Wood Mackenzie analysis summarises the dynamics of the past 5 years and points to moves among the Western OEMs towards simplification of the turbine offering as an attempt to address profitability. New turbine designs require economies of scale to deliver value, to compete for capacity in highly competitive auctions. Many new and larger turbine designs were introduced by Western OEMs over the past 5 years, and these new turbines have struggled to reach manufacturing economies of scale in a depressed market. While larger turbines promise substantial cost reduction through more efficient material use and reduced turbine counts, these massive turbines are exposed to higher logistics expenses and require significant new supply chain investment for larger components. In addition, the increased size and complexity of the components also increase the risk of quality issues. Ultimately, the innovation arms race, which has driven down the cost of clean energy for the consumer, has led to shorter product life cycles, inadequate testing periods, and complex product portfolios. The perfect storm that hit wind supply chain since the beginning of the 2020s is forcing Western wind OEMs and suppliers to slow down the introduction of new products and reduced the appetite for radical design changes. Meanwhile, the arms race continues among Chinese manufacturers. This led to a drop in the cost of Chinese turbines of 30% in 2023 and increased market share by Chinese OEMs in rest of the world markets outside of Europe and the US. Of the OEMs listed in Figure 46, it is notable that only Goldwind, Chinese, has consistently delivered a net profit over the last 5 years, predominantly earned in its home market, China. Yet even its margins are underwhelming. Goldwind margins in a good year are lower by comparison to what most of the major auto manufacturers earned in 2023. It too posted a manufacturing loss for the first half of 2023. Furthermore, OEMs' service businesses are often used to cross-subsidize their manufacturing activities, masking the depths of their struggles. F. A vicious cycle. Underinvestment in quality, worsening financial woe. Underinvestment, leading to underfunding of quality control and assurance, impacts reliability. Eventually, this leads to a vicious cycle of worsening financial performance. The very public example of this was SGRE in 2023, when warranty claim costs from serial defects across both its onshore and offshore fleet surged, with €472 million booked in a 3-month period for unexpected costs associated with turbine failures, exacerbating already stressed financials, to end the financial year with net losses after special items of €4.3 billion. A further cost of €1.6 billion over 2024 and 2025 was calculated by the company in their plans to fix the underlying quality issues. GE similarly posted significant losses due to warranty provisions, also in 2023. As a theme, such quality issues are not limited to any single OEM and have been bubbling for some time. In January 2023, Vestas reported above-target warranty provisions for 12 straight quarters. With fierce competition, the race for ever bigger and hence more efficient turbines to optimize the total cost per megawatt continues. But with size, risk allocation becomes further skewed as increasing warranty costs attributed to the OEMs grew in parallel with the turbine costs. The simple result is that, from LM Blades to Nordex, Vestas to Siemens Gamesa, European wind manufacturing factories have been closing just when capacity needs to double. Meanwhile, the arms race continues in China, as the Wood Mackenzie analysis affirms. Turbine growth is driven by fierce competition in China, as the market is expected to grow by 6.2% annually in the next 10 years. Furthermore, the additional cost pressure in the post-subsidy era is favouring larger turbines to reduce capex. The development of GW-scale wind bases also favours the development of gigantic turbines. Furthermore, the additional cost pressure in the post-subsidy era is favouring larger turbines to reduce capex. The development of GW-scale wind bases also favours the development of gigantic turbines. Yet WoodMac caution that aggressive growth in China may also prove unsustainable, with quality and reliability concerns following the Western OEM experience on the horizon, and a profitability crunch possibly looming. Indeed, Goldwind posted a financial loss in its manufacturing division for H1 2023. The market failure we are faced with is the need, as committed during COP28, to triple renewable energy installation by 2030, and then beyond, when the growth rate, at current profit margins, is not financially sustainable for the supply chain. Reconciling this requires intentional and urgent market intervention. G. Failed auctions. As we know, markets take time to correct themselves. The 2022 to 2023 period saw an awakening and pushback from project developers who experienced the macroeconomic impacts of increased materials cost, supply chain delays pressures, and costs, and the rising cost of finance, to the extent that previously attractive economics of ready-to-build projects were destroyed. The risk-to-return profile being offered by governments in public procurement processes was grossly inadequate for the new reality, and there were failed and undersubscribed auctions across the globe, including the RES 3 auction in Ireland, German onshore auctions, and probably most notably the UK offshore Round 5 auction, all in September 2023. Prior to that, in August 2022, the Chilean public procurement auction failed to secure more than 15% of the offered generation contracts. The UK's failed Round 5 offshore wind auction, where not a single bid was placed, was described by Ed Miliband as an energy security disaster. The failure here was the stated cap, a maximum price the UK government was willing to pay. A maximum of £44 per megawatt hour, when the developers were advising that £65 per megawatt hour was much closer to the actual costs at the time. The most recent auction has raised that to £73 per megawatt hour. When considering their bid, the generators will need to anticipate the cost of their turbines 2 to 5 years ahead, as that will be when they are actually procured. It is the increase in costs against the now unrealistic price guarantees that have led to the withdrawal of successful bidders. This future pricing risk has long been resolved in the airline sector, where contracts signed years before have the pricing indexed, so they move with increases in capital cost. Indeed, for previously awarded auctions, ready-to-build projects in the period 2022 to 23 faced as much as 40% increases in the cost base due to macro factors and supply chain constraints since bid date, all of which was typically contractually allocated to the project owners with no automatic ability to adjust the price locked in during the past auction process. Moreover, interest rates increased. In many cases, a 2% rate increase results in a 20% hit to the LCOE, as shown by Wood Mackenzie analysis, with no opportunity to pass higher costs through to consumers. Any one of these factors would be very problematic to a project's economics. But taken together, for many projects around the world contracted during the relevant period, these factors have destroyed the investment case, resulting in countless gigawatts that were scheduled to be in construction at time of writing, not being financed and not being built. Major onshore and offshore projects were affected. Developers including Ørsted, Equinor, BP, and Shell sought to cancel or renegotiate power contracts for the first commercial-scale US wind farms due to start operating between 2025 and 2028. In June 2023, Germany had to offer a return option to 5 gigawatts of unbuilt wind projects awarded in 2021 and 2022. And there were others. Simply put, given the risks assumed or allocated to the project developers under these programs, accounting for the changes to the cost base, the recalculated return expectations no longer met the investment risk-to-return requirements. Thus, absent an increase in the PPA price or risk allocation corrections, there are many planned projects which at best have been delayed by years, with some stalled indefinitely. Circa 1.2 gigawatts of projects awarded under the 5th iteration of the previously highly successful South African Public Procurement Programme, or EIPPP, for example, despite that country's ongoing energy crisis and rolling blackouts. We believe this creates an as yet unrecognised gap in the forecasted rollout of utility-scale renewable energy deployment in many global markets, putting the global emissions reduction trajectory even further behind than may be yet understood. Alternative route to market. Private contracts. Where possible, project developers can seek instead to contract with private commercial and industrial customers, private offtake, who, to some degree, may tend to respond more commercially than those responsible for public procurement. This is being pursued widely and can be seen as a partial market self-correction. However, this segment of the market, at least the segment with bankable customers as PPA contract counterparts, is not large enough. This, firstly, exacerbates the already significant competition among technically viable ready-to-build projects, and secondly, does not replace the need for wider procurement of new, clean generation to supply domestic and small commercial end users. It does not then fully restore investor confidence, or go far enough to meet emissions targets. Furthermore, in markets where there is no possibility to sell directly to private offtake in the short term, investors quickly take decisions to exit the markets, taking FDI and valuable renewable energy project delivery expertise with them. This sets local capacity building back years. None of this is conducive to delivering on climate goals in time. Geographic exceptions to this trend are markets where governments have already proactively and strategically intervened in support of renewable energy build-out, with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and in China. In fact, in its Global Electricity Review 2024, Ember reported that 51% of new solar and 60% of new wind generation capacity installed in 2023 was in China. This is no coincidence. H. Discriminate impact of higher interest rates. The Wood-Mackenzie analysis, cited above, further points to the disproportionate impact that increasing interest rates have on clean energy investment. No fuel costs result in higher upfront capital intensity and more debt financing compared to the oil and gas sector. Higher interest rates disproportionately affect renewables and nuclear power, Their high capital intensity and low returns mean future projects will be at risk. They warn of the impact to the energy transition in what is expected to be a structurally higher interest rate environment for the next decade or more. The energy transition to net zero could require $75 trillion of investment by 2050. In a higher interest rate scenario, achieving net zero will be even harder and more costly. The graph from the Wood-Mackenzie study illustrates the case of US generation as an example, where a 2 percentage point increase in the risk-free interest rate pushes up the levelized cost of electricity, LCOE, by as much as 20% for renewables. The comparative increase in LCOE for a combined cycle gas turbine plant is only 11%. Worth noting is the relatively light leverage assumption of 55%, when many renewable energy projects contain upwards of 70% debt. The difference could be worse still. I. Curtailment and dispatch down, or underutilisation. As renewable energy becomes more prevalent across Europe, not only is grid expansion not taking place in anticipation of the required renewable energy generation expansion, but market systems are not changing quickly enough to ensure the usage of existing renewable energy is maximised by society. In particular, the operation of interconnection across Europe will need to be optimised to trade based on carbon rather than cost. Take the island of Ireland as an example. With a high renewables penetration system, but a relatively old gas generation portfolio as its backup, Ireland and Northern Ireland have 2 interconnectors with Britain, and throughout most of 2023 and 2024 to date, there has been a significant shift in how energy has been traded on those interconnectors. Interconnector flows take precedence over domestic energy market operations within Europe. If the marginal price in one jurisdiction is cheaper than the marginal price in another jurisdiction, then energy will flow towards the more expensive region. These interconnector flows are then locked in place, and the local jurisdictional market must trade around them at a high level. In Ireland and Northern Ireland, a perverse situation has arisen since Q1 2023, where the high price of generation from the local gas fleet has set local prices higher than those in neighbouring Great Britain. As a result, interconnector flows have overwhelmingly been set to send power into Ireland and Northern Ireland from Great Britain. The local domestic market on the island of Ireland then treats these imports as fixed, and the rest of the system must dispatch around these flows. At time of writing, this has resulted in a significant increase in wind energy curtailment on the island of Ireland for more than 12 months. When the system could continue outputting domestic renewable energy, it is instead forced to take the imported power from a neighbouring jurisdiction regardless of where that power is coming from, renewable or fossil power. The very large increase in renewable curtailment is damaging investor confidence in the Irish market and significantly damaging the business models of existing renewable power producers. It is an outcome of market design which, though entirely foreseeable during the energy transition, was not designed to deal with such scenarios and merits examination at a European level. When curtailment costs are socialised to the consumer, such inefficiencies will damage not only investor sentiment, but also public sentiment, thus posing a significant socio-economic risk to the energy transition, if not recognised as a characteristic of the transition which needs to be managed in a coordinated manner, top-down, across the region. Is Ireland the canary in the gold mine, or an outlier? That's the question which needs to be answered quickly. Here again, we might look to learn from China's handling of similar issues during their ongoing dramatic transition. China felt similar pain in the mid-2010s, took strategic action, and have reaped the rewards, but continue to actively manage what is recognised as an endemic energy transition issue. Consequences. The potential pace of renewable energy installations has been negatively impacted in most global markets in recent years, possibly with the exception of China and the US, due to the negative investment and lending signals resulting from the litany of market failures described above. This was exacerbated by supply chain difficulties with the post-COVID surge in demand and the war in Ukraine, and increasing interest rates, which disproportionately affect renewable energy investments compared to fossil fuel generation. Another critical point here, actually, is that the trend in low profitability of the renewable manufacturing industry, particularly for wind, existed prior to those events. Disappearing profits had been evident for the previous 5 years at least, see Figure 48, and with those, investment appetite. We believe the predominant reverse auction system is monstrously unfair. Neither non-price value attribution nor risk allocation have been appropriate. Competition is artificially intensified since wholesale markets are not designed to support non-recourse financed renewable generation with fixed costs. The current mixed generation wholesale markets were designed for fossil fuel generation. They are not fit for purpose for renewables, and changes agreed under the EU energy market reform are inadequate. There remains in both wholesale and forward markets a failure to distinguish between renewable and fossil fuel generation assets. Virtually all the lifetime cost of the renewable generation is upfront, compared to most of the cost in gas generation being in buying the fuel to burn. In the former case, the renewables developer needs to have absolute confidence about both the price, as set in the auction, and the quantity of energy they will sell, over the full debt payback period, a period multiple times longer than typical 4-year forward contracts. The fossil fuel generator, on the other hand, is exposed to very little risk, as they can bid into the day-ahead market a price that fully recompenses them for their cost of gas at that time, and if they are selected, their profit is guaranteed, and if not, they don't have to buy the gas, and so won't incur a loss. The nature of current wholesale and forward markets, therefore, and resulting hyper-competition in the remaining routes to market, in deregulated or liberalised electricity markets, is such that renewable energy generators have low market power and, with few exceptions, are price takers. Despite, firstly, the need of our civilization to accelerate renewable energy capacity build-out by a factor of 3 this decade alone, according to the science, and more beyond. Secondly, the fact that commercialised and scalable technology and know-how is available. And thirdly, the fact that a fair price for renewable energy would still be cheaper for consumers and citizens, both in the short and the long run, than continuing with polluting fossil fuel generation, even before considering externalities. Investment is not flowing at the required rate. That is because a fair price is not paid in sufficient cases. The risk-to-return profit simply does not compute for queues of would-be investors. As one observer put it, the wall of money that was expected under the current economics is more like a dam. Case study: the renewables paradox, Chile. If we are to move to a 100% renewable generation system, it is imperative that we acknowledge some basics. The electricity markets were designed with fossil fuels and hydro in mind, and variable renewables present challenges and opportunities, but require a paradigm shift and some regulatory changes to achieve high levels of penetration. Chile can be seen as an example of that, as the country has dealt with the challenge since 2017. Perhaps a good way of putting it is a postcard from the future, as described by Michael Liebrich. When there is a significant share of variable renewables, these plants are exposed to prolonged periods of zero marginal pricing in wholesale markets. For example, when grid transmission expansion does not keep up with the volume of generation from variable renewables and storage is insufficient. This normally goes hand in hand with grid curtailment. Marginal pricing was designed to cover fuel costs, the cost of producing an additional kilowatt hour. As discussed already, it is not an appropriate pricing mechanism to compensate renewable energy when the only plants generating in the market are renewable plants, as increasingly happens as we move through the energy transition. In addition, with more than a hint of irony, some power purchase agreements can leave variable renewables exposed to the risk of highly volatile fossil fuel prices by asking them to supply 24/7, or in line with demand. In the absence of storage, therefore, when not generating, they must purchase energy in the short-term market to fulfill the PPA requirements. Since 2017, in Chilean public procurement PPAs, both of these situations arise concurrently, with some temporary relief following a transmission upgrade before solar installation outpaced grid again. Interested readers will find a comprehensive explanation of the complex situation, implications, and measures to address them in a 3-part series of articles by Patricia Derez, The Renewables Paradox. But in brief, the government provided regulated tenders that had built-in location-based wholesale market risk, exposure to nodal price differences between project and off-taker locations. Meanwhile, planned grid expansion was years behind the rapid growth of solar, although the state had long since known the market was regarded as having one of the best solar resources on the planet. Mitigating factors to support a low-emissions grid could have included incentivizing the electrification of daytime energy consumption to balance demand and supply, or adjustments to legacy grid technical minimum baseload rules, which meant a constant portion of inflexible coal generation displaced clean solar power. However, no such mitigations were implemented to prioritize a cleaner energy system, which regularly resulted in lost revenues for renewable plant, due to curtailment of wind and solar, and prolonged zero marginal pricing during solar hours. All the electricity generated simply could not be transmitted to where the residual demand was, in cities in central Chile, or was dispatched down in favour of coal, and sometimes gas. Then the perfect storm of macroeconomic factors hit, with the post-COVID and post-Ukrainian invasion commodity price surge in 2022 and 23. Due to the specifics of the commercial arrangements in the public procurement PPA contracts, renewable energy generation plants were contractually obliged to buy fossil fuel-generated energy at peak cost, effectively subsidizing the soaring costs of thermal generation for consumers. Renewable energy plants across the country suffered significant financial losses. Over the course of many months, the combination of unprecedented levels of market exposure and lost revenues eroded the ability of well over 1 gigawatt of quality, newly installed wind and solar projects to generate enough net proceeds to repay their project finance debt, let alone expected investor returns. By September 2022, more than 25 companies were in arrears with debt repayments. The crisis ultimately led to established renewable energy players filing for Chapter 11, or major debt restructurings. Meanwhile, politically motivated decisions were taken to shield consumers from increasing fossil fuel generation costs, preventing the price signals that drove some of the behaviour-driven market corrections seen in Europe during the same period. At the same time, incumbent thermal generation plants enjoyed record profits, partly supported by renewable generators' losses. While impacted lenders and investors of the renewable assets worked together to successfully restructure the debt, the losses incurred were significant. Certain beneficial reforms have since been implemented in the market, though at time of writing, no amendments to the public contracts to redress the unfair risk allocation have been made. As a positive, the market is preparing for a ramp-up in energy storage to help address grid balancing issues ahead of critical grid expansion, which is still years away from delivery, and significant curtailment persists, although the China example tells us that such challenges are solvable with political will. Somewhat unhelpfully post-crisis, it was recognised by Energy Minister Diego Pardo that the measures should have been taken decades ago. Lessons. The Chilean case study is important as it clearly illustrates 1. All renewable energy revenues must urgently be completely decoupled from and made fully independent of fossil fuel prices. 2. Grid expansion should be planned and implemented in anticipation of what should now be obvious renewable energy expansion in every country, alongside developing incentives for demand response, shifting consumption to better match clean generation hours. Dynamic pricing is one example. 3. Wholesale markets that can award a price of zero for any form of generation, especially for prolonged periods, will simply provide no incentive for anyone to continue to invest in renewable generation there, even if electricity demand is increasing. 4. The weaknesses, or significant risks, of nodal pricing during the energy transition if the costs of negative externalities have not already been addressed. When grid expansion does not keep pace with renewable energy deployment, and nodal prices are volatile due to volatile fossil fuel generation, or zero marginal pricing, or both, decoupling can be extreme. This is deeply unfair, in particular to renewable energy participants, who typically are the lowest cost producers, and tend to be located furthest from demand centres due to the nature of the natural resource. 5. Finally, as a deeper dive on the case study identifies, when markets do fail, anything less than radical market reform to design solutions, a new market, from first principles to expressly suit variable renewable energy generation, plus interconnection with demand management and storage, means increasingly complex changes to the original fossil fuel-suited market design. Rounds of increasingly difficult changes to the latter may still not quite accommodate the required growth of clean, affordable, renewable energy on the system. It suggests false economies in persisting with outdated energy markets during the energy transition, and is a strong argument away from prolonged phasing of market reforms. The think slow, act fast principle may be worth bearing in mind. Indeed, market architects, may be well advised to read How Big Things Get Done and consider the principles summarised in Chapter 5. When decarbonising our energy system is a real priority, which it must be, failure to address these points in good time is an abject failure of governance and a serious deterrent to investment, which completely undermines the potential and needed pace of the energy transition. In fact, the risk of impact is not just in the offending country, but with potential consequences in other, unrelated geographic markets that end up getting deprioritised when balance sheet losses force investors to make difficult decisions about where to focus remaining capital. Hence, governments seeking stable inward investment from renewable energy companies should ensure good enabling environment support and collaboration with the industry. They must consistently back up state targets with concrete plans and follow through on implementation, grid, planning, ports, market reforms, etc., according to promised timeframes, as the risks to developers are many. To conclude our deep dive on energy market failures, we assert that competition is great when it is fair. It spurs innovation and continuous improvement, ensuring choice and value to the consumer. But dysfunction in the market creates unnecessary destruction, deep, lasting erosion of investor confidence, and lasting delay to the build-out of otherwise perfectly deliverable, reliable, clean, renewable energy projects at scale. And while investors take knocks, and there will be permanent casualties, it is the consumers and citizens, small businesses, families, children, who lose out most. Yet this is what is occurring right across the globe. The fact is that the market for energy in Europe and elsewhere is simply not fit for the purpose of decarbonisation. It is not fit for air quality and public health. It is not fit to deliver stable energy costs for our citizens and businesses. The deck is still stacked.